My husband asked. For a divorce. He said. I want the house, the cars, everything except the son. My lawyer begged me to fight. I said. Give it all to him. Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed everything over. He didn't know I'd already won. He smiled until his lawyer turned pale when his attorney leaned close and murmured 5 quiet words into his ear. Just 5. And the look on Daniel's face, the same smug, pleased with himself expression I'd seen across our breakfast table for 15 years, drained of all color. He went pale as a sheet. His hands began to shake, and the paperwork he'd been so eager to sign fluttered uncontrollably, like leaves caught in heavy wind. As for me, for the first time in 3 long years I smiled. But I'm jumping ahead. I need to rewind a bit because none of this makes sense unless you understand how we ended up here. You need to know how a woman everyone assumed had completely lost her mind was actually playing the slowest, most patient game of her entire life. My name is Rachel Miller. I'm 34 years old, and until 3 months ago I was married to Daniel Brooks. 15 years. That's longer than most celebrity marriages, longer than some countries have technically existed, and definitely longer than my patience should have held out. Still, I'm stubborn. Always have been. I inherited that trait straight from my grandmother. I met Daniel when I was 17. I'd finished high school early, not because I was some kind of prodigy, but because I was practical, driven, and desperate to escape my parents' house. I landed a job at Henderson & Price law firm as a file clerk. The pay was minimum wage, the paper cuts were constant, but the job was mine. By 18, I'd worked my way up to legal assistant. I had a knack for details, numbers, and knowing when to stay quiet while paying attention to everything. Daniel was 24 when we met at a client event. He was charming, ambitious, and overflowing with big plans about building a real estate empire. He spoke about the future like it was already guaranteed, like success was just sitting there waiting for him to claim it. He told me he was going to create something incredible. I told him I could help with the paperwork. Real romance, right? We got married when I was 19. Evan came along a year later when I was 20. I kept my job at the law firm part-time while raising our son, quietly building my 401k, and saving every extra dollar I could. My grandmother always said a woman should have her own money. Not hidden money, she'd always add. Just money that belonged to her alone. Something no one could take away. When I was 23, Daniel's business finally started to gain real traction. He asked me to leave the law firm and work for him full-time. He said he needed someone he could trust completely. Someone to manage the finances, handle clients, coordinate contractors, and keep everything running smoothly. That someone was me. I became his unpaid everything. I handled the books, ran the office, managed clients, coordinated contractors, decorated model homes, organized marketing, planned events, you name it. All of that while raising Evan, running our household, and somehow making sure everyone stayed fed and mostly happy. On paper, my title was wife. In reality, I was everything else. For 11 years, I poured every ounce of myself into Daniel's dream. And for those same 11 years, he collected all the praise. He got the awards, the recognition, the applause. At industry events, I was always introduced as Daniel's wife. During celebrations, he thanked his team, his mentors, his vision, but somehow my name never quite made the list. At some point, things began to change. He stopped asking for my input and started making decisions on his own. He worked later and later. Then came the criticism, small at first. How I dressed, what I cooked, my so-called lack of ambition. The irony was almost impressive. I was running his entire back office for free, raising his son, and keeping his life from falling apart, but sure, I wasn't ambitious enough. Then, 3 months ago, he finally dropped the bomb. He came home on a Tuesday night while I was cooking dinner. His favorite meal, actually, because apparently I enjoy putting effort into things that go completely unappreciated. He sat me down at the kitchen table with a look that wasn't sad or apologetic, just cold and businesslike. I want a divorce, he said. Then he followed it up with, I want the house, the cars, the business, everything. You can keep Evan. He said it like he was placing an order. I'll take the assets, you hold on to the kid. Like our 15-year-old son was a leftover slice of pizza. Like Evan was some inconvenience he was generously allowing me to keep. I just stared at him. 15 years of marriage, and this was how it ended. Right there at our kitchen table between the salt shaker and the butter dish, like I was just another item he no longer wanted. What I didn't realize at the time, what I wouldn't discover until later, was that Daniel had been planning this for months. He already had a lawyer, Richard Collins. Expensive. Experienced. While I was meal prepping and scheduling his dentist appointments, he was quietly preparing his exit. I'd been blindsided by the man I trusted more than anyone. The next day, his mother showed up. Margaret Brooks. A woman who had treated me like hired help for 15 years arrived with perfectly styled hair and a carefully practiced look of sympathy. She patted my hand and told me I should have worked harder to keep her son happy. Men have needs, dear, she said, like she was explaining something complex to a slow child. Her advice was rich, considering her own husband spent 7 days a week on the golf course just to avoid sharing a room with her. But yes, clearly I was the problem. That first week was a blur. Daniel moved me into the guest room. Documents appeared. Settlements were proposed. Timelines were set. Everything moved so fast I felt like I was drowning. To the outside world, I looked like exactly what I was supposed to be, a discarded wife. A woman whose life had just fallen apart. A victim who never saw it coming. But here's what Daniel didn't know. What nobody knew. 3 years earlier, I'd found something buried deep inside his financial records, something he believed was hidden forever. And from that moment on, I'd been quietly preparing, waiting, planning. Before we keep going, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Thank you. Now back to the mess. Within a week of announcing the divorce, Daniel had taken full control. The guest room became my permanent space in what used to be my home. My closet shrank from a walk-in to 2 small sections he graciously allowed me to keep. The message couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't my house anymore. 2 weeks later, he started bringing her around. Ashley Sawyer, 27 years old. She worked at his company. Of course she did. She had that flawless Instagram look. Blonde highlights, perfect nails, yoga pants that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. She walked into my kitchen like she owned the place. She wore my apron, my grandmother's apron, while making smoothies in my blender. And that's where things really started to get interesting. She was younger than my marriage, younger than my favorite handbag, but she could make a great smoothie, so I guess that counted for something. Daniel showed her off like a prize he just won. They sprawled out on my couch, watched my television, and ate from my plates. He'd casually drape his arm around her right in front of me, like I was part of the furniture, like I'd already faded into the background. The humiliation didn't happen all at once. It ramped up day by day. First, he canceled my personal credit card. "We need to separate finances," he said in that calm, reasonable tone people use when they're doing something cruel. Then he shut down the joint card. Not long after that, he suggested, very politely, that I might want to find somewhere else to stay while we figured things out. Somewhere else. In my own house. Then Margaret showed up to help me pack. And by help, I mean she went through my belongings and decided what I was allowed to keep. Old clothes? Fine. Some family photos? Maybe. My grandmother's recipe box? She paused on that one, weighing it in her hands like she was debating whether it should belong to her instead. What I was absolutely not permitted to take was anything of value. No jewelry Daniel had bought me over the past 15 years. None of the furniture I personally picked out. Those were marital assets, Margaret explained, and Daniel was entitled to them. She stuffed my things into garbage bags. Not boxes. Trash bags. Like I was refused being hauled out to the curb. Through all of this, there was one person I believed I could still trust. Melissa Holloway. We'd been friends since high school. 20 years of shared history through boyfriends, breakups, babies, and everything else life throws at you. She was the first person I called after Daniel dropped the divorce bomb. She seemed endlessly supportive. She checked in constantly. She asked how I was holding up. She listened. She came over with wine and let me cry on her shoulder. She told me I deserved better. She said Daniel was making a massive mistake. But something didn't feel right. First, it was subtle. Daniel somehow knew my plans before I'd even made them. When I casually mentioned to Melissa that I was considering fighting for the house, Evan came home the very next day saying his dad told him it would never work. When I told Melissa I was looking at apartments in a specific neighborhood, Daniel casually remarked that the area was probably too expensive for me. That's when it clicked. Looking back, the signs had been there for years. The way Melissa's face lit up whenever Daniel entered a room. The way she praised him just a little too enthusiastically. The way she laughed just a bit too hard at his jokes. She always asked about him first. "How's Daniel? How's the business? Is Daniel happy?" She'd been carrying a quiet crush on my husband for 15 years. And Daniel, who collected admirers the way some people collect stamps, knew exactly how to use it. He made her feel special. Important. Different from other women. He probably hinted that they might end up together after the divorce. Just enough hope to keep her loyal. My best friend had become his informant. 20 years of friendship sold out for some flirting and empty promises. Honestly, Melissa should have charged more. But the worst part wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Margaret. It wasn't even Melissa. The worst part was Evan. My son saw everything. He saw the girlfriend. He saw his grandmother stuffing my life into garbage bags. He saw the way his father looked at me like I didn't matter. And Daniel was working on him slowly, carefully, dripping poison into his ear day after day. "Your mom is making this difficult. I just want everyone to be happy. I'm trying to be fair, but she won't cooperate." Evan started pulling away from me. Not in anger, just distance. Confusion. He didn't know who to trust. And his father was very, very convincing. I could have lost the house. I could have lost the money. I could have lost everything I'd spent 15 years building. But watching my son look at me like I was the problem, that was the real knife. That was the wound that actually bled. So I hired a lawyer. Laura Bennett. She came highly recommended by my old firm. 52 years old, sharp as a blade, and completely allergic to nonsense. She reviewed my case and laid out her strategy without hesitation. "You helped build this business," she told me. "You're entitled to half of everything. The house, the company, the accounts. We fight." I stared at her for a long moment. What if I don't want to fight? Laura looked at me like I'd suddenly started speaking another language. Like I'd suggested sending Daniel a thank you card and a fruit basket. She assumed I was broken, depressed, too worn down to stand up for myself. She had no idea. Evan and I moved into a small apartment. 2 bedrooms. 1 bathroom. A kitchen barely bigger than my old pantry. Half our boxes didn't even fit. They sat stacked in the corner of Evan's room. A silent monument to how far we'd fallen. Meanwhile, Daniel posted photos with Ashley. New chapter. New energy. Blessed, he wrote. Margaret commented underneath. So happy for you, sweetheart. You deserve joy. My sister called me furious. You need a shark of a lawyer, she said. Take him for everything he's worth. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone knew exactly what I should do. Everyone saw a woman who had given up, who couldn't fight, who was letting her husband steamroll her. Everyone was wrong. Here's the thing about being underestimated: people stop paying attention to you. They stop being careful. They stop guarding their secrets. And that's when you learn everything. 3 years. That's how long I'd been carrying this secret. 3 years of knowing the truth about Daniel Brooks and his shiny, glamorous, completely fake empire. It all started on a random Tuesday night, 3 years before the divorce. Daniel was working late again. He was always working late by then, though I didn't yet understand what that really meant. I was reviewing the company books, reconciling accounts, doing the unglamorous work that kept his business afloat. That's when I noticed something odd. A transfer to an account I didn't recognize. Then another. Then another. A pattern began to form. Money flowing out of our accounts into places I'd never seen before. I kept digging. I stayed up until 3 in the morning following the trail. And what I uncovered made my blood run cold. Daniel had been taking loans against everything we owned. The house. Our beautiful house that everyone admired. It had 3 mortgages on it. The original loan was $400,000. A second mortgage for $350,000 taken out 4 years earlier. Then a third mortgage, another $350,000, taken just 2 years ago. Total debt, $1.1 million. Actual value of the house, $850,000. We were $250,000 underwater on a home I thought we owned outright. The business situation was even uglier. Credit lines were maxed out at $200,000. Back taxes totaled $85,000. Vendors were owed another $120,000. Equipment loans added $75,000 more. The company Daniel bragged about at every party, the one he claimed was booming, was actually drowning under nearly $500,000 in debt. Even the cars were an illusion. All 3 were leased, each with massive balloon payments coming due. We didn't truly own anything. We were just chained to very expensive monthly bills. I sat alone in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, surrounded by stacks of printed statements, and started doing the math. Total debt came out to roughly $1.9 million. Actual asset value? Maybe $1.6 million if we were lucky. That put us at least $300,000 underwater, and probably more. The question was obvious. Where had all that money gone? I kept digging. Over the next several weeks, I followed every transaction trail I could find. What emerged was devastating. $180,000 poured into cryptocurrency, completely wiped out. $75,000 lost to gambling. An apartment I'd never heard of. Rented for a woman I didn't know existed. $60,000 spent on rent and furnishings alone. Then there were the lifestyle expenses that never came home. Luxury watches. Designer suits. Trips I was never invited on. Another $85,000 gone. My husband wasn't building an empire. He was stacking a house of cards using borrowed cards and somehow setting them on fire at the same time. We looked wealthy the same way a mannequin looks alive. Convincing from far away, hollow the moment you got close. My first instinct was to confront him. I wanted to scream, cry, demand answers. But I knew Daniel too well. I'd watched him operate for years. If I challenged him, he'd manipulate the conversation. He'd explain everything away, make me doubt myself, maybe even convince me I was the problem. And worse, if he knew I knew, he might try to get his hands on my separate money. Because I'd always kept a little something that was mine. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head. A woman should have her own money. I still had my IRA from my law firm days. I'd rolled it over when I quit but never touched it. By then, it had grown to about $180,000. That money was mine, earned independently, legally classified as separate property. And then there was my grandmother herself. She passed when I was 28 and left me $340,000. Her will was crystal clear. This money was for Rachel alone. I'd kept it in a separate account for 6 years, never mixing it with Daniel's finances, never using it for household expenses. She'd kept her own account for 50 years. Not secret money, she used to say. Just mine. Smartest woman I ever knew. All told, I had around $520,000 that was completely legally mine, so I didn't confront Daniel. I protected myself instead. With the help of my uncle, a retired accountant, I set up an irrevocable trust for Evan. My IRA and my inheritance went straight into that trust. My name wasn't listed as a beneficiary. Daniel's name was nowhere near it. The trust was for Evan's future. College, a first home, emergencies, and it was untouchable. Then I documented everything. Every mortgage. Every hidden account. Every suspicious transaction. I printed copies and stored them at my sister's house. I placed duplicates in a safe deposit box. I backed everything up on an encrypted drive. And then I waited. I knew Daniel would leave eventually. Men like him always do. They get bored. They find someone younger. Or they decide they deserve more. All I had to do was be ready when the moment came. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of watching him dig deeper. 3 years of smiling through dinner parties while knowing our entire life was built on quicksand. I became very good at patience. And even better at pretending I had no idea my husband was financially drowning us both. So when Daniel finally demanded a divorce, and demanded the house, the cars, the business, everything, I almost laughed out loud. He wasn't asking for assets. He was demanding debt. He just didn't know it yet. Back in the present, I sat across from Laura Bennett and placed 3 thick binders on her desk. 3 years of evidence. Every mortgage statement. Every loan document. Every hidden account. She read in silence for nearly an hour. When she finally looked up, her expression had completely changed. You've known about this for 3 years? I was waiting for him to leave, I said. I knew he would. And when he demanded everything, he demanded all the debt too. He just doesn't understand that yet. Laura leaned back in her chair. The pity was gone. The concern disappeared. What replaced it looked a lot like awe. So when you sign over the assets, she said slowly, you walk away clean. He takes the mortgages, the business debt, the lease obligations, every bit of it becomes his sole responsibility. And my inheritance and retirement accounts, I added. Separate property. Never commingled. Legally protected. Sitting safely in a trust for my son. Laura was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile, a dangerous one. Mrs. Miller, she said, I owe you an apology. I thought you'd given up. I smiled back. Everyone thinks that. That's kind of the point. In that moment, Laura stopped looking at me like a lost kitten and started looking at me like a chess grandmaster. I prefer grandmaster. Better wardrobe. The trap was already built. The numbers were verified. The documentation was airtight. All I had left to do was let Daniel believe he was winning. And nobody plays the gracious loser better than a woman who's been practicing for 15 years. The next 3 months were a masterclass in performance. I became exactly what everyone expected. Broken. Defeated. Barely holding on. I showed up to mediation with red eyes and shaking hands. I spoke softly and carefully, like a woman who'd lost all confidence. I asked for so little that even the mediator looked uncomfortable. I just want enough to start over, I said during our second session. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I know the business is his life's work. I know the house means everything to him. I don't want to tear our family apart any more than it already is. I requested $50,000 in cash, my personal belongings, and shared custody of Evan. That was it. Daniel agreed immediately. He was probably bracing for a fight over half of everything, what any competent lawyer would expect. Instead, I was asking for crumbs. He looked at me across that mediation table with something close to pity. Like I was a wounded animal he was kindly putting out of its misery. Honestly, I deserved an Oscar for that performance. Or at least a Golden Globe. I'd been handed the role of a lifetime, and my only audience was my lying, cheating, soon-to-be bankrupt ex-husband. With every passing week, Daniel's arrogance grew louder. He stopped being cautious. He stopped pretending to be reasonable. He told anyone who would listen that I hadn't even tried. She just gave up, he bragged to his golf buddies. I offered her a fair deal, and she took it without a fight. Margaret was worse. Much worse. She boasted at her book club, at church gatherings, at every social event she attended. Daniel is keeping everything, she'd announced proudly. That woman didn't get a dime. I always knew she wasn't strong enough for my son. To celebrate his so-called victory, Daniel bought himself a new watch. $15,000. I know the exact amount because I saw the charge hit the business account. He was still using company funds for personal indulgences. Still shoveling dirt into the hole he didn't realize he was standing in. He wore that watch to our next mediation session, making sure it caught my eye. Around the same time, he took Ashley to dinner at La Maison, the French restaurant where we'd celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary. He posted photos online. Life is good when you're with the right person, he wrote. The right person, meaning the one who didn't yet know about his mountain of debt. Meanwhile, Ashley had started redecorating my house. New furniture appeared in the living room. New artwork went up on the walls. And then she painted my kitchen gray. She painted it gray. I had spent 3 full weeks choosing that sage green. 3 weeks of paint samples, lighting tests, and second-guessing myself until I found the perfect shade. And she covered it up with flat, builder-grade gray like it meant nothing. Gray like her personality. Gray like her future with Daniel once she figured out he was broke. Honestly, it was poetic. Melissa kept calling, fishing for information under the disguise of concern. I played my part perfectly. How are you holding up? She'd ask, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I just want it to be over. I'd say, letting my voice crack. I can't fight anymore. I don't have the energy. Within hours, Daniel would know. I could practically feel him relaxing, dropping his guard even more. Melissa thought she was manipulating me. In reality, she was just a delivery service. And not a very expensive one. But while the adults were busy playing games, Evan was watching. And my son, my sharp, observant, wonderful son, was starting to notice the cracks. He noticed his dad's new $15,000 watch. Then he heard Daniel say they couldn't afford the school trip to Washington, D.C. He saw Ashley's shopping bags piling up by the front door, then listened to his father complain about how tight money was. He noticed the mismatch between the image Daniel projected and the excuses he kept making. One evening, Evan came over to my tiny apartment and sat down at my second-hand kitchen table. He looked at me with those serious eyes, so much like his father's, but with something Daniel had lost years ago. Honesty. Mom, he said quietly, is Dad actually rich? I studied my son for a long moment. What do you think? He thought about it. I think something's wrong, he said. I think he's pretending. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Trust me, I told him. Just wait a little longer. My 15-year-old figured out the truth before 2 lawyers and a certified accountant did. I really should bill his college fund for consulting fees. Behind the scenes, Laura was preparing our legal strategy with surgical precision. The main divorce agreement stated clearly that I was surrendering all claims to marital property. The house, the business, the vehicles, everything would belong to Daniel. In exchange, I'd receive my modest cash settlement and walk away. But attached to that agreement was an addendum, a detailed liability disclosure. Every mortgage, every loan, every line of credit, every obligation connected to those assets. When Daniel signed for the assets, he was also legally accepting every liability. The mortgages became his alone. The business debts transferred entirely to him. The car leases were now his problem. It was all laid out in black and white. Perfectly legal. Completely devastating. Legal documents are like poetry, Laura told me once. Boring, expensive poetry that can ruin someone's life. My favorite kind. 2 weeks before the final hearing, Daniel's lawyer, Richard Collins, called Laura with concerns. My client is assuming substantial assets, Richard said carefully. I'd like to request a full financial audit before finalizing, just to verify everything. Laura kept her tone calm. Of course. We're happy to provide any documentation you need. But when Richard brought the suggestion to Daniel, my soon-to-be ex shut it down instantly. No audits, Daniel snapped. I built that company. I know exactly what it's worth. I'm not paying an accountant to tell me what I already know. Richard pushed back. I strongly recommend we verify asset values before you sign. This is significant. Daniel cut him off. Ashley wants this done. I want this done. No more delays. Richard had been practicing law for over 30 years. He knew when a client was making a serious mistake. He also knew he couldn't force a grown man to listen. So he presented Daniel with a waiver. A document confirming that Richard had advised an independent financial review, and that Daniel was declining against counsel's recommendation. Daniel signed it without reading a word, just like he signed everything else. Never underestimate the power of an impatient girlfriend to make a man skip the fine print. Ashley was worth millions to me in legal strategy. The night before the hearing, Daniel sent me a text. Thank you for not making this ugly. I stared at that message for a long time. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of building his business, raising his son, managing his life. And he was thanking me for not being difficult while he threw me away. I typed back. I just want what's best for Evan. And I meant it. What was best for Evan was a secure future, a fully funded trust, and a father who was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. Laura called me that evening. Thursday, 9 a.m. Final hearing. Judge Eleanor Price, she said. Are you ready? I stood there in my small apartment and took it all in. The second-hand couch, the boxes still stacked in the corner, the tiny kitchen I painted sage green because it made me think of hope. I smiled to myself. I'd been ready for this moment for 3 years. 3 long years of waiting, and now it was finally here. I felt like a kid on Christmas morning. If Christmas morning involved divorce court and financial revenge. Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Daniel would walk into that courtroom expecting to collect his prize. What he didn't know was that he was about to inherit a financial avalanche, one he'd personally signed up for. And the best part? He'd requested it in writing with witnesses. If you've made it this far, you already know something satisfying is coming. Go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready for Daniel to get exactly what he deserves. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? I've got plenty more stories like this one. Trust me. Now let's finish it. Thursday, April 17th, 9 a.m. Courtroom 4B. I remember every single detail of that morning. The way sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The smell of old wood mixed with floor polish. The low murmur of lawyers quietly shuffling papers. This was the room where 15 years of marriage would officially end, and where 3 years of patience would finally pay off. Daniel arrived first. Of course he did. He wore his best suit, the charcoal Armani I'd helped him choose for a client dinner 3 years earlier. His new watch caught the light as he shook hands with Richard. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man about to close a very profitable deal. Ashley waited out in the hallway. She wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but she wanted to be nearby for moral support. I caught a glimpse of her through the door. Perfect makeup, designer purse, scrolling through her phone like this was just another boring appointment. Margaret was there too, seated in the gallery. She dressed up for the occasion, probably planning a celebratory lunch with Daniel afterward. When I walked in, she gave me a small smile. The kind you give someone you think you've already beaten. I arrived a few minutes after Daniel. Simple navy dress. No jewelry. Hair pulled back into a low bun. I looked exhausted, defeated, like a woman who had nothing left to fight for. Perfect. I looked like someone who'd given up on life and fashion at the same time. Very convincing. I should honestly teach acting classes. Judge Eleanor Price entered and everyone rose. She was in her early 60s, silver hair neatly styled, reading glasses resting on her nose. 30 years on the family court bench. She'd seen every trick, every lie, every manipulation couples could throw at each other. Nothing surprised her anymore. She skimmed the file, then looked up. Brooks versus Brooks. Final dissolution hearing. I understand the parties have reached an agreement. Richard stood first. Yes, Your Honor. My client, Daniel Brooks, will assume all marital assets, including the family residence, the real estate development business, and all associated vehicles. In exchange, Mrs. Miller will receive a cash settlement of $50,000. Laura rose beside me. That's correct, Your Honor. My client agrees to relinquish all claims to the marital assets and accepts the proposed settlement. Judge Price turned her attention to me. She studied my face carefully, probably searching for signs of pressure or fear. Any indication I was being forced into a terrible deal. Mrs. Miller, she said, I need to confirm that you understand what you're agreeing to today. You are giving up your claim to substantial property, including the family home and the business you helped build. Are you certain this is what you want? I kept my voice soft, just slightly unsteady. Yes, Your Honor. I understand. And you're entering into this agreement voluntarily? No one is pressuring you? No, Your Honor. I glanced down at my hands, then back up. I just want my husband to have everything he asked for. I want this to be over. The judge studied me for another long moment. I could practically hear her weighing whether to intervene, whether to order a continuance, whether to protect me from what appeared to be a terrible decision. But I had legal representation. I was answering clearly. I was an adult making my own choice. Very well, she said at last. Let's proceed. The clerk passed out the final documents, page after page of dense legal language, signatures required every few pages. Daniel signed quickly, barely glancing at what he was agreeing to. He wanted it finished. He wanted to get back to his shiny new life, his new girlfriend, his freedom. I signed slowly, deliberately. Every pen stroke was careful and precise. This was the moment I'd waited 3 years for, and I intended to savor it. Across the courtroom, Daniel glanced at Margaret and smiled. She nodded back proudly. Out in the hallway, his phone buzzed. Probably Ashley sending encouragement. He even checked it during his own divorce hearing. That was the kind of man he was. Meanwhile, Richard Collins did what good lawyers do. He reviewed the entire document package one last time. Main agreement signed. Asset schedule signed. Settlement terms signed. Then he reached the addendum. The liability disclosure statement. I watched his face as he read it. Watched confusion flash across his expression. Watched him flip back a page, then forward again, as if hoping he'd misunderstood something. He hadn't. Richard went pale. He leaned toward Daniel, trying to keep his voice low. Sir, he whispered, we need to talk. Daniel waved him off, still basking in his victory. Not now. We're almost done. Richard tried again, more urgently. Sir, you're assuming all the debt. Daniel turned, frowning. What? The liability disclosure, Richard whispered, tapping the papers. The mortgages, the business liens, it's all here. You're personally responsible for everything. For the first time that morning, Daniel actually looked at what he'd signed. I watched his eyes move across the page. Watched the color drain from his face. House $1. $1 million owed. Market value $850,000. Business $480,000 in combined debt. Vehicles $115,000 in lease obligations. Additional personal liabilities $200,000. Total debt approximately $1. $9 million. Net value of everything he just claimed negative $300,000. Daniel hadn't won the lottery. He'd won the bill for it. Daniel shot up from his chair so fast it scraped loudly across the courtroom floor. This isn't right, he blurted out. He looked at me, then at the judge, then back down at the papers like they might suddenly rearrange themselves. She hid this from me, he said, pointing in my direction. This is fraud. Judge Price's voice snapped through the room. Mr. Brooks, sit down. These numbers aren't real, Daniel insisted, his voice climbing higher by the second. She manipulated the documents. Mr. Brooks, the judge cut in sharply, sit down. He dropped back into his chair, but his hands were shaking now. That confident grin he'd walked in with was gone, replaced by something raw and frantic. Panic doesn't wear suits well. Judge Price glanced at the paperwork, then back at him. Mr. Brooks, I'm reviewing the liability disclosure attached to this agreement. These are debts tied directly to the assets you are claiming, your property, your business, your name. She leaned forward slightly and locked eyes with him. Are you telling this court that you don't know your own financial situation? Silence. Watching Daniel try to explain why he didn't recognize his own debts was like watching a cat attempt to explain a shattered vase. Interesting but not believable for a second. Richard cleared his throat. Your Honor, for the record, I advised my client to obtain an independent financial audit before today's hearing. He declined. I have documentation. He handed over the waiver, the one Daniel had signed without reading, the one that clearly stated Richard had recommended a full review and Daniel had refused. Judge Price skimmed it. So Mr. Brooks was advised to verify these figures and chose not to. She looked directly at Daniel. Is that correct? Daniel stared at the paper like it had just bitten him. I didn't. I thought. Is that your signature, Mr. Brooks? A long pause. Yes. Then you assumed this risk voluntarily, Judge Price said evenly. You had the opportunity to investigate. You chose not to. This agreement stands. Daniel turned toward me, desperation finally cracking through the last of his composure. You knew, he said, his voice breaking. You knew about all of this. I met his eyes calmly. I was your bookkeeper for 11 years, Daniel, I said. Of course I knew. His face went through emotions faster than I could count. Confusion, anger, betrayal, fear. And then finally the one I'd been waiting for. Realization. The understanding that he had done this to himself. I want to withdraw the agreement, Daniel said quickly, spinning back toward the judge. I didn't understand what I was signing. This isn't fair. Judge Price shook her head. Mr. Brooks, you signed documents before this court stating you understood and agreed to all terms. You were represented by competent counsel. You declined additional review. She paused. Your wife did not hide anything. These are your debts. Your mortgages. Your obligations. Then the gavel came down. Mrs. Miller, you have your settlement. Mr. Brooks, you receive the assets as agreed, along with all associated liabilities. This marriage is dissolved. I stood, smoothed my dress, and picked up my purse. Then I looked at Daniel one last time. He was slumped in his chair, papers scattered, his entire world collapsing around him. You said you wanted everything except Evan, I said quietly. I gave you exactly what you asked for. I walked out of that courtroom without looking back. In the hallway I could hear Daniel's voice rising, shouting at Richard, accusing him, threatening lawsuits, demanding to know how this happened. Richard's calm reply carried clearly. I advised you to get an audit. I have it in writing. You refused. Through the glass doors I saw Ashley's face change as she listened. I watched her look at Daniel, really look at him, and see something other than the successful businessman she thought she was getting. She was gone before I reached the elevator. Moving fast. Heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. No backward glance. Ashley's exit was quicker than her entrance into my marriage. At least she was consistent. I stepped outside into the April sunshine. The sky was blue. The air was warm. Behind me, my ex-husband was still yelling about fairness, fraud, and how none of this was his fault. Ahead of me was a new life. Smaller. Simpler. But completely, entirely mine. The collapse came faster than even I expected. Within 2 weeks, Ashley had moved out of the house, packed her things in the middle of the night and left a note that read, "This isn't what I signed up for." The great kitchen sat empty. Within a month, Daniel tried to sell the house. But when you owe more than something is worth, there are no buyers. Just banks calling about missed payments and realtors suggesting short sales. By the second month, the business started defaulting. Vendors filed lawsuits. The credit line was frozen. The company Daniel had spent 15 years bragging about, and the one I'd spent 11 years quietly supporting, crumbled into dust. By month 3, Daniel was meeting with bankruptcy attorneys. The man who once boasted about his empire was now figuring out which assets he could protect from creditors. The answer was almost none. Margaret's perfect son started calling relatives for loans, showing up unannounced with explanations and excuses. Nobody knew about the debt, he told them. Rachel must have hidden it. I was tricked. But the paperwork told a different story. The mortgages were in his name. The loans were in his name. The gambling losses. The crypto disasters. The secret apartment. All his choices. All his signatures. I heard Margaret's Christmas newsletter that year was very short. Daniel is exploring new opportunities. Yes, opportunities in debt restructuring. Funny how parallel lives resolve themselves with such poetic symmetry. About a week after the hearing, Melissa called me. Her voice was shaking. I had no idea it was this bad, she said. I'm so sorry, Rachel. I never meant for. I thought Daniel and I didn't answer. I didn't respond. I didn't give her the closure she wanted. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some friendships don't deserve a second chance. 20 years of history traded for a wink and empty promises from a man who used everyone around him. She called 3 more times. Then she stopped. I imagine she's still waiting for Daniel to notice her. She's going to be waiting a very long time. Margaret tried a different tactic next, going through Evan. And that is where she made her final mistake. Tell your mother I didn't know about the money problems, Margaret told him. Tell her I'm sorry for how I treated her. Tell her I want to talk. Evan looked at his grandmother, the woman who'd stuffed his mom's clothes into garbage bags, who'd called her worthless, who'd backed his father without ever asking a single question, and said calmly, Mom's busy rebuilding her life. She doesn't have time for excuses. Margaret wanted forgiveness. I wanted peace. Only one of us got what we were after. Evan, my smart, observant, wonderful son, finally understood everything. Not because I sat him down and explained it, but because he put the pieces together himself. He read the court documents. He listened to his father's excuses. He watched Ashley leave. He watched Margaret panic. He watched the whole illusion fall apart. About a month after the divorce, he sat with me in my small apartment, the one with the sage green kitchen, the one with secondhand furniture and boxes that were finally unpacked. You waited 3 years, he said quietly. You knew all along and you just waited. I nodded. I needed to make sure you were protected, I told him. Whatever happened between your father and me, I had to know you'd be okay. The trust fund $520,000 safe, untouched, and completely out of reach. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he hugged me. Really hugged me. The kind of hug I hadn't gotten from my 15-year-old son in a long time. The kind that said I get it now. The kind that said I'm proud of you. 15-year-old boys don't usually hug their moms unless it matters. I knew I'd done something right. My $50,000 settlement went toward getting established. First month's rent. Security deposit. Furniture that didn't wobble or fall apart. It wasn't luxury, but it was stability. The trust fund stayed exactly where it was. Evan's future, college, maybe a first home someday. a safety net no one could ever take from him. As for me, I enrolled in interior design courses at the community college. The dream I'd shelved at 23 so I could help Daniel build his empire. Now I was finally building my own. I started small. My first real client was a woman named Linda, 52 years old, fresh out of a 28-year marriage. She stood in her empty apartment, overwhelmed, and asked me, "How do you even start over?" I thought about it for a second. "One room at a time," I told her. "One color at a time. One day at a time." We painted her kitchen sage green. She cried when she saw it. "Happy tears," she said. "It feels like a new beginning." About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Daniel showed up at my apartment. I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, not the healthy kind. Dark circles sat under his eyes. His suit was wrinkled. The watch was gone. He looked like a man who'd been to war and lost. He stood in my doorway, and for just a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I didn't know it was this bad," he said quietly. "I made mistakes. I see that now. I never meant for any of this to happen." I leaned against the doorframe and really looked at him. The man I'd loved for nearly half my life. The man who'd thrown me away like trash. The man now drowning in the consequences of his own choices. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Maybe we can figure something out." Maybe we could. He couldn't finish. He couldn't bring himself to ask for what he actually wanted. Help. My help. After everything. "You asked for everything except Evan," I said evenly. "And you got exactly what you wanted. Rachel, please." "Goodbye, Daniel." I closed the door. He stood in the hallway for 10 full minutes. I know because I watched him through the peephole while eating ice cream. Best show I've ever seen. 5 stars. Would absolutely watch again. That night, after Evan went to bed, I sat in my small living room and looked at my grandmother's photo on the shelf. Her recipe box sat beside it, the one thing Margaret almost took. The one thing that mattered most. "You were right about everything, Grandma," I said softly. "Keep your own money. Know your worth. And never let anyone make you feel small." The apartment was quiet. Small. Nothing like the house I'd lived in for 15 years. But it was mine. Every paint color. Every piece of furniture. Every decision. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was free. Thank you so much for watching.